Good night.
So in any case, great to finally meet you.
Same here.
Justin. Thanks, Calvin. Appreciate the printing.
Check test. Check.
button. It'll blink on red for it being on. And
Good morning. The Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony for an oversight hearing entitled Examining the Office of Insular Affairs' Role in Fostering Prosperity in the Pacific Territories and Addressing External Threats to Peace and Security. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and to the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moylan, and the gentlewoman from the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Ms. King-Hines, be allowed to sit and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning. Today's hearing topic is particularly timely as our country faces ongoing threats seeking to end the American way of life. Our adversaries seek to subvert, dismantle, and replace U.S. leadership, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. The People's Republic of China, under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, has waged political and information warfare in the Indo-Pacific in an attempt to coerce political and business officials and undermine U.S. interests. Furthermore, the PRC has posed a direct challenge to U.S. national security and strategic posture by rapidly developing weapon systems designed to threaten the United States. The PRC has been directly linked with cyber attacks against U.S. government servers and the flow of illicit narcotics in our communities. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly known as North Korea, also seeks to undermine the U.S. and challenge U.S. leadership in the region. While having far fewer resources than the PRC, the threat that North Korea poses should not be underestimated. Under the dictatorship of Kim Jong-un, North Korea has become increasingly hostile to the U.S. and to its allies. Perceiving the U.S. as an existential threat, Kim Jong-un has pursued an aggressive nuclear weapon development program and cyber attack capabilities aimed at causing maximum harm to the United States. The Pacific territories of American Samoa, Guam, and the Northern Marianas Islands are on the front lines against these threats by the PRC and North Korea in the Indo-Pacific. From being in range of hypersonic and ballistic missiles to espionage attempts, the Pacific territories face an increasingly hostile geopolitical environment. As such, it is critical that the relevant agencies within the U.S. federal government work to address these threats. The Department of the Interior's Office of Insular Affairs, OIA, plays a key role in this endeavor as the office charged with managing U.S. federal relations with the insular areas. The OIA is among the primary avenues for the territories to find solutions to the threats they face with relevant federal agencies. The OIA also plays a leading role in supporting the economic health of the territories within its jurisdiction by administering grant programs benefiting the territories. As the Pacific territories rely heavily on U.S. federal assistance, the fiscal impact of OIA grant programs cannot be overstated. Fostering prosperity in the territories enables the territories to not only become more self-sufficient, but also equips the territories with the resources they need to push back against the activities of the PRC and North Korea in their communities. It is critical that the OIA increase coordination with agency partners and the United States Congress to ensure that the U.S. government is appropriately responding to attempts by the PRC and North Korea to threaten peace and spread malign influence in the territories. As we proceed with today's discussion, I want to take this moment to make it clear that when we refer to threats from China and North Korea, we are referring to the Chinese Communist Party and the North Korean government, respectively. We recognize and firmly believe in the distinction between the totalitarian regimes in Beijing and Pyongyang and the Chinese people and North Korean people who long for democracy and freedom from autocratic rule. In many ways, this makes the PRC and North Korea an even greater threat, as their actions are not driven by national interests, but by the nefarious desires of the ruling elites. Beijing and Pyongyang have made it abundantly clear that threatening the U.S. is their priority. I thank our witnesses for appearing before us today and look forward to their testimony. The chair now recognizes the ranking minority member for any statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so very happy to be here again addressing issues and the Blue Continent with the freely associated states and the islands in the Pacific. And, you know, I love the fact that the Indian and Insular Affairs Subcommittee represents the people part of the Natural Resources Committee. And it was an incredible honor to visit the freely associated states and Guam last year when we were reviewing the COFAR agreements, which were skillfully, I think, came to a conclusion and signed. And when we were engaged in that outreach, in those negotiations, in the visits, in the hearings, we heard over and over again about the threats that the People's Republic of China posed to our interests in the freely associated states and the Pacific territories. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, the PRC offers economic aid and infrastructure developments to shape political outcomes, to improve perceptions. And they're doing this not because they are an incredibly generous organization, but we know that they want to destabilize the relationships between the United States and these are most generous of allies. And that's why it's really frustrating when we talk about the importance of pushing back against the PRC to look at the destruction of USAID, to understand that in a tiny office, the Office of Insular Affairs, 4 people were fired. You cannot say we are going to take the threat of the PRC seriously and then destroy and eliminate and weaken the tools that we have to fight their nefarious influence. So when this wonderful trip, and I'm so grateful for the chairman, and hopefully you'll get to go on one, because it was amazing, this trip that we did, and I met many of you through this whole process. You know, we were there, and they told us about that. They told us about the trawlers who were trying to just cut up the cables, right? We saw the buildings where there were big signs proclaiming, China is building this for you, right? And when we then eliminate against congressional, without congressional authority, something like the USAID, which was itself doing much more quiet projects like the cable to Palau, that has now been frozen. We have now stopped, I don't know if you know this, Chairman, we have stopped the construction of a cable that would connect Palau underground. Key infrastructure, and key infrastructure that is also useful to us. When you visit, you will see our bases. You will see the way we depend on these to protect our airspace, to identify what is coming over. And it is so crucial to us here because these are the islands and these are our allies that are closest to China. And when we start destroying the tools and the people and undermining it, what are we doing? And let me talk about the people. The Medicaid cuts that are proposed in the budget resolution would hit these territories incredibly hard. In American Samoa, 76% of the population qualifies for Medicaid or TRIP. In the Northern Mariana Islands, 36% of residents are enrolled in Medicaid or CHIP. So when we start undermining the VA, when we start undermining Medicaid, and we're not going to get $880 billion from fraud. I mean, anybody who repeats that knows it's not true. There's not that much fraud there. So it is going to affect people. And we are going to hope that we get 3 Republicans who stand with Democrats to say, do not do this for the many reasons, whether it's your own constituents or recognizing that we must maintain positive relationships and we must maintain the warmth of the friendship and the warmth of the alliance that we have with the people of the territories and in the Blue Continent. I look forward to your testimony today in this Oversight Committee, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Ledger-Fernandez. The chair now recognizes the Ranking Member of the House Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Huffman, for any statement. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know I'm sometimes a skunk at the picnic at these hearings. I don't enjoy that. I wish it wasn't necessary. But I'm going to start off with something very positive and consensus-based. This hearing is on a super important subject, especially timely given the threats posed by the People's Republic of China and North Korea to U.S. territories and freely associated states in the Pacific. And I'll go further, Mr. Chairman. Your opening remarks were spot on. You absolutely nailed it, including the nuance about the difference between these tyrannical regimes and the people that they represent. You really captured it. Everyone here says that we care a lot about these threats and these people. However, and here comes the skunk part, the Trump administration right now is actively undermining efforts to address these threats through a reckless, indiscriminate approach led by DOGE, people that have never spent one day in public service or government and have no idea what they are doing. They're taking a meat axe to the American workforce in a way that is crippling the very personnel needed to safeguard peace and security in the region. And, you know, we heard all of this fawning applause last night from the cult section of the House chamber when Elon Musk was introduced and whenever Doge was mentioned. But you know who else is really cheering for Doge right now and Elon Musk? China and North Korea. They are thrilled, just as thrilled as the cult section was last night. The Office of Insular Affairs, which provides critical support to the U.S. Pacific territories facing unique economic, environmental, and geopolitical challenges, and the USAID, as the ranking member mentioned, are facing substantial cuts in funding and personnel to finance tax breaks for billionaires. And we will hear our witnesses describe how the U.S. Pacific territories and freely associated states, because of their strategic significance, are prime targets for PRC influence operations ranging from propaganda and traditional espionage to more covert influence operations targeted at elites and public opinions. We'll also hear how the PRC is undermining relations between the territories and the U.S. federal government to exert corrosive influence in the territories and render them less able to defend themselves, let alone American national security interests. But what we won't hear, I hope I'm wrong, but what I think we won't hear today is Republicans from Congress standing up to what the Trump-Musk administration is doing right now to our national security interests, this dangerous, short-sighted attack on agencies that protect American interests and the U.S. territories from China and North Korea. The Trump administration has already fired more than 5,600 USAID employees and plans to eliminate a majority of U.S. development and humanitarian assistance abroad. USAID's humanitarian and development assistance underpins our close relationships with the Federated States of Micronesia and the Republic of the Marshall Islands under the Compacts of Free Association Agreement, or COFA, which benefiting communities and families across the Pacific Islands also find quite important, quite existential. Under COFA, USAID leads U.S. disaster response efforts and has invested nearly $100 million in disaster relief and reconstruction since 2008. The PRC government capitalizes on instability and natural disasters in this vulnerable region to make inroads. And the vacuum that will be left if USAID is allowed to be sacrificed by DOGE will give China a prime opportunity to swoop in and expand its influence. If the Trump administration is truly serious about bolstering our Pacific territories and our Pacific Island nations against Chinese threats and North Korean threats, they sure have a funny way of showing it. Decapitating the one agency that projects American influence abroad through developmental assistance and soft power, which are our best tools for countering Chinese and North Korean encroachment across the Pacific. This is just a self-inflicted wound. So it is time for my Republican colleagues to stop fawning over Elon Musk and Doge and start walking the walk for the stuff that they say they care about, and start protecting U.S. interests. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Now I will introduce the witnesses for our panel. The first is Mr. Dean Chang, Senior Fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies in Arlington, Virginia. Next is Mr. Bruce Klinger, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Next is Mr. Francisco Ben-Cosme, former China Policy Lead at USAID here in Washington, D.C. And last is Ms. Cleo Pascal, non-resident Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. Welcome. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We do use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute left, the light turns yellow, and at the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow all witnesses on the panel to testify before member questioning. The chairman now recognizes Mr. Dean Chang for 5 minutes. Mr. Chang.
Good morning, Chairperson Hurd, Ranking Member Fernandez, Representatives. My name is Dean Chang. I'm a non-resident Senior Fellow with the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. My comments this morning are my own. My comments this morning are intended to provide some context for better understanding of the Chinese interest in the Central Pacific and the threat posed therein. For the PRC and the United States, the importance of the Central Pacific region will only increase in the coming years. Taiwan and Western Pacific tensions are only likely to rise. There is little sign of abatement. Growing PLA, People's Liberation Army capabilities, will make operating in the Western Pacific within what's sometimes termed the first island chain more difficult. And indeed, in the initial phase of any conflict, U.S. forces' ability to operate in that area is going to be extraordinarily challenging. American resets and greater focus will only further lead to the need for expanded infrastructure in the Central Pacific as a fallback position for U.S. security operations and efforts. Here it is notable that the Chinese competition with the United States is going to intensify because, in part, China has significant resources. The PRC has the ability to undertake not simply whole of government, but whole of society efforts, and therefore U.S. dominance in the region is going to be challenged. China has a variety of tools at its disposal. This foremost set of tools are in fact not necessarily military, but economic. These include aid, where China is the second largest donor to the region after Australia. Investments, as reflected recently in the Cook Islands. These often include tourism, deep-sea mineral exploration, and shipbuilding. China has also indicated to Fiji that it intends to invest in that nation's port facilities and shipyards. Security assistance. We are fortunate at this time that China is not yet a major source of arms to the region, but that is only for the moment. It is, however, employing an interesting form of legal warfare by providing significant police training to nations such as the Solomon Islands and Fiji. But above all, the Chinese military, the PLA, is increasingly able to present a very daunting portfolio of capabilities throughout the Pacific west of Hawaii. And here it is important to note that the U.S. cannot afford to rely only on the island of Guam, if only because there is only so much physical space there, and also because of the need, if one intends to operate in the face of these growing Chinese military capabilities, to have a wider dispersal and resilience in terms of our capabilities. A very brief survey of the kinds of growing capabilities that the PLA possesses Begins with the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy. It is now the world's largest fleet. It has 140 major surface combatants among its 370 ships. It has an increasingly growing range. This past week, we have watched the PLA Navy conduct live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea, separating Australia from New Zealand to such an extent that Australia had to issue a warning to airliners traversing the region. Notably, the Tasman Sea is actually farther away from Chinese naval bases than Guam is, reflecting the reality that the Chinese will be able to operate in the Central Pacific, in the waters around Guam, should it choose to do so. The Chinese Navy will be operating under increasingly the cover of the PLA Air Force, which also has an expanding range. It has benefited from the addition of significant aerial refueling capability. The Chinese have also demonstrated the ability now to launch not only cruise missiles, but ballistic missiles from some of its types of bombers. And as worrisome, the PLA Air Force is now fielding the kinds of electronic support aircraft, airborne early warning, and airborne command posts that used to be primarily the purview of the United States. This reflects a recognition by the PLA that modern warfare is not simply about shooting, but it's about finding and countering an adversary's command and control. Above all, the PLA relies upon its rocket force, the PLA rocket force, and on long-range missiles, ballistic and cruise, for long-range precision strike. In this regard, we see the Chinese fielding a growing set of capabilities, including the DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile, in fact, replacing the previous shorter-range DF-21. Both of these have carrier-killer capabilities. The DF-26 apparently is specifically intended to range Guam. The DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle and the DF-27 IRBM, which has a hypersonic glide vehicle option, again, intended to be aimed at Guam. With regards to considerations for long-term responses, then, it is essential that U.S. facilities in the Western Pacific be more hardened as well as more dispersed. It is also, however, useful to recognize that while U.S. and Western governments typically do not build infrastructure, corporations do, and that with the issue of, for example, cable building, Google has been building cable networks across the Central Pacific, which does add to resilience. My appreciation to the committee and the subcommittee for the opportunity to be here this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chang. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bruce Klinger for 5 minutes. Mr. Klinger.
Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Ledger-Fernandez, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. My comments this morning are my own. North Korea's nuclear, missile, and conventional forces are a formidable threat to the United States and its forces, citizens, and bases in the Indo-Pacific. Pyongyang's history of provocation and intimidation is a consistent indicator of the regime's intent to achieve its political objectives through the threat or execution of force. North Korea is producing a new generation of advanced mobile missiles that, in addition to being more accurate, more mobile, and more difficult to detect and target, have an enhanced ability to evade Allied missile defenses. In 2022, Pyongyang passed a law that lowered the threshold for its use of nuclear weapons. The new legislation codifies a decade of North Korean statements that highlighted both the defensive mission for its nuclear arsenal while concurrently threatening a preemptive nuclear attack in response to even perceived Allied preparations for an attack, raising the potential for stumbling into a nuclear war. North Korea's diversified nuclear attack strategy includes, 1, targeting South Korean ports and airfields to prevent the U.S. from augmenting forces during a conflict, as well as threatening South Korean leadership and military targets to coerce Seoul to surrender or abandon a counteroffensive attack on North Korea. 2, removing Japan from the equation. Pyongyang could threaten nuclear attacks to intimidate Tokyo into rejecting the use of Japanese ports, airfields, and bases for U.S. and UN command operations against North Korea. 3, attacking U.S. bases in Guam. North Korea could use the Hwasong-12 liquid-fueled and Hwasong-16 solid-fueled intermediate-range ballistic missiles, both equipped with 2 variants of maneuverable warheads, to conduct theater nuclear strikes against U.S. bases in Guam to prevent the flow of forces and logistics to the Korean Peninsula. Pyongyang could also use long-range ground and sea-launched cruise missiles. North Korea has repeatedly threatened to attack Guam. I provided a compilation of these threats in my written testimony. Some examples include, the U.S. should not forget that the Andersen Air Force Base on Guam is within striking range of the North Korea's precision strike means. And all the U.S. military bases in the operational theater in the Pacific, including Guam, will face ruin in the face of an all-out and substantial attack. In November 2023, North Korea successfully launched its first military reconnaissance satellite. Pyongyang announced the satellite surveilled Andersen Air Force Base, Apra Harbor, and other major U.S. military bases in Guam. And 4, threatening the U.S. mainland. North Korea has developed a series of ICBMs capable of attacking anywhere in the continental United States, including the Hwasong-17, the world's largest mobile missile, which may carry 3 or 4 nuclear warheads, and the Hwasong-18 and 19 solid-fuel ICBMs. Pyongyang's deployment of more missiles on mobile launchers with multiple warheads risks overwhelming the limited U.S. missile defenses protecting the American homeland. North Korea's future capabilities open dangerous doors. In a few years, North Korea could have 100 to 200 nuclear warheads, dozens of mobile ICBMs, and hundreds of improved survivable ground-based missiles, as well as submarine launch missiles. Greater North Korean nuclear capabilities could undermine the effectiveness of existing Allied military plans. North Korea's ability to target American cities with thermonuclear weapons could inhibit U.S. responses or exacerbate growing Allied concerns about the viability of the U.S. extended deterrence guarantee. What should the U.S. do? Affirm America's commitment to defend its allies. Washington should make absolutely clear to friend and foe alike that it will defend its allies by continually reaffirming its extended deterrence guarantee to use all necessary force, including nuclear weapons, in response to a North Korean attack. Enhance strategic defense of the American homeland. The U.S. should continue plans to augment the current force of 44 ground-based interceptors to 64 by fielding the next generation interceptor, which has improved capabilities to better engage North Korea's advanced missiles. Augment U.S. regional ballistic missile defense. Pyongyang's expanding missile force increases the threat to U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific region. Washington should augment the existing THAAD missile defense system on Guam, which is a critical node in U.S. regional military plans. The United States should deploy an Aegis Ashore system on Guam while simultaneously initiating an effort to improve the system incrementally with additional sensors and shooters, and complete modernization programs for U.S. nuclear forces. In conclusion, the United States must ensure that it can protect the American homeland and U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific region against the growing North Korean nuclear and missile threat. Washington should coordinate with South Korea and Japan to improve comprehensive Allied missile defenses. The U.S. and its allies must also have sufficient offensive capabilities to reduce the number of North Korean missiles that are launched. Thank you for the honor of appearing before you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Klingner, for that testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. Francisco Ben-Cosme for 5 minutes. Mr. Ben-Cosme.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Ledger-Fernandez, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify before you today. Earlier this year, I ended my appointment as the China policy lead for the USAID, and prior to that, I was the deputy for the compact negotiations, which we worked closely with the subcommittee to negotiate and ultimately pass. I've been asked to focus my remarks on the impact of closing USAID has had on the Pacific Islands for peace and security, and I'll make 3 points. First is that presence matters to compete with our adversaries. The United States is at risk of ceding its influence in the Pacific Islands and repeating the same mistakes we failed to learn after World War II. The PRC has stepped into our breach and has exploited the United States' absence. In response, we spent the last 6 years saying the United States would be intensifying our engagement in the region, and we did so. USAID announced it was opening its office in Suva, Fiji, and established a country representative in Papua New Guinea. We also upped our diplomatic by opening up new embassies in the region. USAID was our ground game for strategic competition, a key alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. While diplomats would focus on high-level diplomacy, USAID would reach out to local communities and demonstrate American support in a tangible way. USAID programs were visible signs of U.S. leadership expanding in the Pacific Islands, oftentimes working alongside our military and diplomats. Gutting foreign assistance limits our ability to influence and address the challenges in the Pacific. The sudden U.S. withdrawal from programs in the Pacific, where we co-funded with our allies and withdrew without consulting or notifying them, leaves multiple partners and allies in the lurch. It is the United States, not the PRC, that now runs the risk of being seen as unreliable and unpredictable. The perfect example is Taiwan. In 2019, Taiwan enjoyed 6 diplomatic alliances with Pacific Island nations. That number went down to 3 in just 5 years. Not only due to Taiwan's expertise on development issues, but also because it helped expand its international space, USAID established the Pacific and American Fund, a 5-year multi-year project co-funded with Taiwan that benefited 8 Pacific Island countries by providing grants on resilience, food security, access to water, health, education, and natural resource management. This was USAID's signature area of cooperation with Taiwan in the region. While China is signing new alarming development deals with the Cook Islands and threatening peace and stability in the Tasman Sea against our allies, Australia and New Zealand, Washington is withdrawing from the region. In the last couple of years, the U.S. started to invest in the region with an affirmative economic agenda to compete with China. For example, USAID partnered with Australia and Japan to support the development of an undersea spur cable, Palau's second, that will connect the country to the world's longest undersea cable and increase the internet bandwidth needed to spark greater economic growth. Undersea cables are also central to strategic competition, given the potential for the cable to be used for espionage and to cut off vital nodes of communication. Second, climate change also remains an existential threat for the Pacific. Sea level rise continues to be above the global average, and ocean heating and acidification are threatening to harm ecosystems and livelihoods. For many Pacific Island countries, this is the single greatest threat to the people of the PICs. In recent years, USAID had announced multiple climate initiatives, including the Pacific Islands Climate Finance Activity to strengthen the capacity of the PICs, to increase access to and improve the management of financing and investments to support climate change mitigations. Interconnected but also distinct is the propensity of natural disasters. The Pacific Island countries are one of the most natural disaster-prone regions in the world, and the compacts designated USAID to be the main agency responsible for disaster response. With the demolition of USAID, no other U.S. agency has the authority, expertise, capacity, or resources to respond to a natural disaster in the Pacific. We are one natural disaster away from the U.S. ceding one of the places where we had a comparative advantage in the Pacific Islands. Finally, food security also remains a challenge in the Pacific Islands as the region faces the triple burden of malnutrition combined with poverty, climate change impacts, which compounds food and malnutrition security risk. There's the PRC, which has the largest deep sea fleet with 17,000 vessels, the majority of which operate in the Pacific. One factor is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. USAID was working closely with NOAA to support the civilian capacity of our partners so they can at least detect and counter unreported fishing. Destroying a crucial national security tool, the trust of our allies, basically overnight, has not made the United States safer, stronger, and more prosperous. It does not put America first. It puts the People Republic of China first, and a Pacific prosperity and security last. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ben-Cosme, for that testimony. I just would like to briefly note for the record that Mr. Ben-Cosme was a political appointee in the previous administration and had resigned prior to the start of the Trump administration. Last but certainly not least, I want to introduce and recognize Ms. Cleo Pascal for 5 minutes. Ms. Pascal.
Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Leisure-Fernandez, thank you. The Pacific territories are deeply experienced at geopolitics. All became part of the United States as a result of wars or strategic contests. Today we'll talk mostly about China or North Korea. 127 years ago for Guam, it was Spain. Then for American Samoa, it was Germany and Britain. For CNMI, it was Japan and the Soviets. By the 1920s, once the Japanese mandate took shape in what's now CNMI and the FAS, it was clear that if a hostile power had control of the Central Pacific, America was not safe. Strategists talk of Mackinder's 1904 heartland theory, that the Eurasian landmass is the geopolitical pivot. It sort of comes down from the center of Russia and China, and control there determines the direction of the world. With evolutions in naval power and the battle for systems between the US and China, a case can now be made that it's the Oceania heartland that determines the direction of the Indo-Pacific, if not the world. The strategic core of Oceania is the U.S. territories and the FAS. For the last 80 years, the Oceania heartland has mostly been a model of a free and open Indo-Pacific benefiting countries worldwide. China, however, sees things differently. It wants to be in a position to reshape the world to its own liking, including being able to take the territory of other countries without effective opposition. We've known this for a while. In 2008, Admiral Keating said a senior Chinese official suggested to him, "You take Hawaii East, we'll take Hawaii West." China has been pursuing its goals in ways General Bronner of the Philippines describes as illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive, known by its initials as ICAD. We've seen extensive and pervasive disruptive PRC ICAD behavior in Oceania. There are many examples from my colleagues, from the members themselves and in my written testimony. China knows as long as the pivot of the Oceania heartland is not under its control, it cannot do what it wants to do in terms of expanding its aggression and its ambitions, including with Taiwan. So what can OIA do? Work both to block the threats while building prosperity. One won't succeed without the other. China uses the allure of commercial engagement with countries, but it doesn't actually want economic engagement to lead to growth. It wants to create economic dependencies. So any attempts at building real prosperity also has to block the expected PRC ICAD attacks. DOI and its OAI are leads in the American territories. OAI has less than 30 people and 2 are judges in American Samoa. Currently, there's no assistant or deputy assistant secretary. It has massive responsibilities for a highly strategic zone. My recommendations are structured to maximize the efficiency and build on Chairman Hurd's opening comments. On blocking, Interior Secretary Burgum has a seat on the NSC. Perhaps this NSC role could be expanded to oversee and coordinate the defense and reinforcement of the Pacific territories and the FAS, which are America's western border, as part of the hemispheric defense approach being adopted by the Trump administration. This could be done in conjunction with the revitalization of the interagency group on the FAS, which is co-chaired by the Secretaries of Interior and State. That could function to focus and reinforce efforts of OIA field agents could play an important block and build role by coordinating locally with other departments and with Washington, including the interagency, and informing via Secretary Burgum's office, the NSC. A key entry point for PRC ICAD activity is corruption. OIA could focus on technical assistance programs designed to counter corruption, waste, fraud, and abuse. The governor of CNMI has repeatedly asked for federal investigations into illegal activities and corruption. A few good federal investigators, perhaps even reservists, might provide the territories and the FAS with more security than any number of F-35s and make it more likely F-35s will be able to operate from there if required. Also helpful is the establishing an FBI field office on Guam and satellite offices in CNMI and American Samoa that can support counter-ICAD activities there and in the FAS. To better advise and coordinate, the territories could set up national security coordinators or councils. That's something Palau has done with great effect. In keeping with the America First investment policy, attention should be paid to proposed investments from foreign entities. Homeland should require all those entering CNMI to have the same visas as those entering the rest of the US. Building requires ground-level assessments, which could be facilitated by OIA field agents. The 3 core areas to focus on are the costs of energy, transportation, and communications, all of which are prohibitively high in the territories. Some examples of the small things that would make a big difference are a waiver from cabotage, the establishment of a fast ferry service between Guam and Rota, hearings on the operations of United Airlines, work to unlock the potential of American Samoa fisheries, centralized tracking and oversight of federal programs. The PRC has made its trajectory clear. It wants to control the Oceania heartland, and it will destroy American communities and families to do it. The goal of OIA should be to ensure that the people of the American territories can build prosperity without the community and security destruction caused by ever-present ICAD activities. As American nationals and citizens, it's the least they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pascal, for that testimony. The chair will now recognize members for 5 minutes for questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Certainly a number of eye-opening and sobering things we heard in that testimony. Mr. Chang, I want to start with you. You mentioned in your opening statement that the PRC poses a multitude of threats to Pacific territories. In your opinion, which of those threats is the most pressing?
Mr. Chairman, that unfortunately is a little bit like asking which child do you love the most. I would suggest that on the one hand, because the Chinese have more resources, they pose an economic challenge for all the reasons that my fellow panelists have noted. This is ongoing, this is every day, this is happening as we speak. As a defense security-focused analyst, I would say, however, that should it come to a conflict, armed conflict, the PLA poses a fundamentally different threat than we have ever faced before. It is more capable. It has a deeper bench in the sense that it has up and running munition supply lines. It will challenge us in cyberspace. It will challenge us in the physical infrastructure of information. It will challenge us in space capabilities where the Central Pacific provides key support. So in terms of day-to-day, they pose an economic and aid and diplomatic threat, but in the background, always present, is a looming and increasing military threat that is going to undermine the confidence of our allies throughout the region, both in the Central and Western Pacific.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. It's multifaceted for sure. Question for Ms. Pascal. How is the presence of illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU, fishing by PRC fishing fleets in the Pacific territorial waters, how is that impacting the economy of these islands?
It's devastating. I mean, and that's combined with some policies that America has put in place, including in American Samoa, that have made it more difficult for the people of the territories to develop the economies themselves. And I'd also note that often the Chinese fleet has at least dual use, if not triple use capabilities. It has, we can see in the Philippines the way that the fishing fleet has intimidated other navies and coast guards, but also there's often a criminal element. So it acts for smuggling, human smuggling, drug smuggling, and those sorts of things as well. So it is a multifaceted, corrosive effect on the economies and the societies and the people of the American territories in the region.
So my follow-up was going to be, what other threats does that IUU fishing pose to the Pacific territory? It sounds like you went through some of them: smuggling, surveillance, harassment, just general economic disruption. I assume potentially military, quasi-military operations as well.
So the way that China operates, things are often braided. So it'll have a commercial front. Oh, you know, we're just a commercial fishery, don't worry about it. Then it'll have a strategic component to it where they just happen to be hovering over cables, for example, or surveilling other activities. And then there's always this criminal element where there's horrific slavery on the fishing fleets. They're smuggling stuff, they're doing bad things. So because of that commercial, strategic, and criminal elements being all braided together, one recommendation is you go after the criminality. You start charging people. You start making sure that there is a cost for doing business with the sort of ICAD activity that the Filipinos have identified. And that will weaken both their commercial argument and their strategic footprint.
Thank you, Ms. Pascal. Mr. Klingner, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between North Korea and Japan, specifically the effectiveness of the potential nuclear threats to the country of Japan? How effective are those in terms of impairing Japan's activities and its coordination with the United States?
The U.S. has assessed for at least a decade that North Korea has nuclear weapons that could be put on missiles that could attack Japan. We've also seen North Korea has specifically threatened Japan, naming specific cities that they would annihilate if Japan were to engage in supporting the U.S. or the UN command during a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So a Japanese prime minister would be faced with the decision of potential attacks on his city with nuclear weapons if he allowed the U.S. and the UN command to flow forces through the region. So it would be a very dire decision by a Japanese prime minister.
Thank you very much. I yield my remaining time back, and at this time I would like to recognize the ranking member, Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, for 5 minutes. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez.
Thank you, Chairman. And I think that as we listen to today's testimony, what is striking is our first two witnesses described in alarming detail the military threats posed by China to the United States, but that flows through this region. It is scary. You've done your job, right? But I would also note that many of your recommendations to this committee address issues with regards to what will our military do in response. and our House Armed Services Committee will look at that really quickly. We then moved down the line and heard from our next two witnesses about the other aspect of how China is undermining the United States' role in this region, and specific recommendations about that. And I loved, Ms. Pascal, your description of the turmoil of going back and forth between this country and that country and what it must feel like, which, you know, we have representatives here who know and whose communities tell them, what does it feel like when you were pushed and abandoned and you know, I think you said it, Mr. Bencombe, the yo-yo effect. And so the importance of creating sort of a consistency is really key. Would you agree, Ms. Pascal and Mr. Bencombe, that the importance of having the United States have a consistent approach and maintain its commitment, not just on the military, but on the soft side, the hearts and minds? Ms. Pascal or Mr. Bencombe, whoever wants to go first.
Absolutely. China feeds and fills in the void in unpredictability and in chaos.
And if I may, the role of the field officers from the Office of Insular Affairs are very important for that. They live in the country. They often have, in fact, one of the best just retired in the Marshall Islands, had been there many years, new people. And that is the permanent physical presence of somebody who listens and is in a position to be able to bridge the gap between Washington and 12 time zones away.
Yeah, it is a long way away, and it is, my eyes were opened both in the travel and then in the stories that were told there. But when you have an office of about 30 and 4 terminated, that ripple effect of the morale, and then the ripple effect of what must it feel like to be in country. We visited USDA programs, we visited USAID programs, we visited many programs where the agencies, as you described, Ms. Pascal, are working in collaboration to build that support. You know, and especially, you know, the Federated States of Micronesia have tended to drift closer to China, is that correct? And Palau is under attack, and their tourism is under attack. And so we need to think about what are ways in which we need to work to strengthen that. And Mr. Bencombe, how do we do it? And what does this moment, like, what are you worried about in this moment where there is chaos coming out of Washington itself? How is that impacting our standing in these states and territories?
It is hugely detrimental to our leadership in the region. As I mentioned, we're one natural disaster in the midst of cyclone season away from USA demonstrating it can no longer respond to something that historically and as part of our compact agreements, we are legally obligated to respond to the FAS, and where China has oftentimes used its military forces to demonstrate and fill in the vacuum in places like humanitarian assistance, undermining our credibility and standing in the region.
Ms. Pascal, do you also agree that maintaining, and you, in fact, I think you do, because in your recommendations you say, do more of this, do more of that, but would you agree that to do that more, you actually need the people to carry it out? Does it happen without people?
You need the people, and you need the linkage back to this town, so that the people have the backing that they need to be able to deliver on. Again, it is difficult to underestimate how much effort the PRC is putting into destroying the communities across the territories, because by destroying the communities, they can weaken the rule of law, and it's much more easy for their ICAT activities to operate and for them to exert influence.
Right, which comes back to we have a military role to play, but we have a really important role to play through Do you agree that USAID plays an important role there, Ms. Pascal?
Across the region, but in the we're talking about the territories, kind of less, right? Obviously.
Yeah, right. Thank you so very much. I've exceeded my time. I think I took 5 seconds of yours, Mr. Chairman. I apologize, but I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Ledger-Fernandez. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from American Samoa, Mrs. Radewagen. Mrs. Radewagen.
Talofa lava and good morning. This is an important hearing for me as we are talking directly about the issues my home of American Samoa faces. So I want to thank the chairman for recognizing enhanced prosperity for American Samoa, Guam, and CNMI is vital to the success of the American model of democracy in the Indo-Pacific. So right now, my congressional district is surrounded on three sides by countries that have increasingly entered China's orbit. And in the past month, independent Samoa and the Cook Islands have signed major deals with China. And separating us from Hawaii and the rest of the United States is Kiribati, which has begun to further align with China. On top of that, Chinese fishing vessels have increasingly penetrated American Samoa's EEZ in conducting IUU fishing in the region. To protect United States sovereignty, and it's been mentioned earlier, we must develop the economies of the Pacific territories. And to protect American Samoa's economy, we need actually a permanent U.S. Coast Guard presence to deter China in the region. I have quite a number of questions. Most of them will be submitted for the record, but I have a couple of questions here for Ms. Cleo Pascal. What is the current state of critical infrastructure in the Pacific territories? And would it be correct to say that the Pacific territories have severe infrastructure needs and that, if left unaddressed, would become threats to national security?
That is absolutely correct. And its critical infrastructure extends to communications. For example, just so people who haven't been there know, when I land in Guam, I can't use my roaming. And if you try to turn on your phone, your charges go up incredibly high. It is everything from the ports to the airports to the cables. All of it needs a very serious reevaluation and support for improvement.
So, Ms. Pascal, would it be fair to say that support for critical infrastructure in the Pacific territories is vital for fostering economic prosperity and that it should be a top priority for the OIA?
Yes, it is a key component of both blocking ICAD activity and building prosperity.
The PRC has recently signed a number of economic agreements with various Pacific Island nations. For instance, Samoa has signed a visa exemption agreement with the PRC to make travel easier for their citizens. Samoa is home to many workers in American Samoa who travel across the border to work in our industries, particularly the tuna cannery. At what cost and risks do these agreements pose for these nations signing these agreements with the PRC?
You've recently seen incidences in Samoa, for example, a Chinese national kidnapping somebody and shooting at police officers. There's increasing drug use and drug distribution. There's very limited ability, and this is something that we also see in CNMI, to deport people who are creating a problem, and so they sit there and create this kind of social destruction. It is extremely disconcerting. And I would just flag up that reliance on Australia and New Zealand in these areas has not been effective. There have been repeated reassurances from Canberra and Wellington, don't worry, we've got this covered. Canberra set up this policing initiative, but we haven't seen the results on the ground. And by grabbing that space and blocking direct American engagement, I think it's been detrimental to the people of the region.
Thank you, Ms. Pascal. Would you agree that these agreements come with strings attached and that the PRC can easily use these agreements as leverage to get what it wants? My time is short.
Yes, that's in fact the purpose of the agreements.
And would you also agree that it should be a priority for the U.S. government, including OIA, to remain vigilant on the potential impacts of these agreements for U.S. national security, especially for the agreements signed with countries in close proximity to the United States?
Yes, they're deliberately setting up footprints close to American territories in the FAS in order to undermine them for their own strategic advantage. And by they, I mean, of course, the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Klinger, North Korea has been increasing its hostile rhetoric towards the Pacific territories. How do you think this rhetoric and possibly actions impact the safety of Americans on the islands?
It certainly is an indication of North Korea's provocative behavior and its belligerent threats towards the region as a component of the threats against U.S. forces and citizens and allies, South Korea, Japan, as well as the American homeland. So certainly it is trying to intimidate the U.S. and its allies to not respond to North Korean coercive behavior or aggressive action if it came to that.
Thank you, Ms. Pascal. Kind of following up on Ms. Ridewagon's questioning, the OIA does play a very critical role in fostering economic prosperity in the territories. Do you think it was fair to say that OIA funding is critical for the Pacific territories and it is important to ensure that these funds are used in a manner to meet U.S. interests and obviously doing that in a fiscally responsible manner?
It is foundational, and it would be particularly helpful if it's combined with proper oversight, so there's transparency and there's trust across the board that these funds are being used properly.
Can you give any specific examples how OIA activity has positively impacted the territories?
There are a lot of very effective technical training programs. In my testimony, I suggest expanding them out to be able to counter corruption, because corruption is undermining a lot of the other good efforts that are being made. So, yeah.
Maybe talk about how some of those efforts have played a role in countering the PRC's maligned activities in the area.
In terms of you mean specific funding towards something else?
Or the ways that the OIA efforts have played in countering the PRC's maligned efforts.
Well, having those knowledgeable field officers in country and building trust and being able to convey information back and forth between Washington and the region has been essential.
All right, and again, the importance of the territories to the United States, I don't think can be overstated. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how the Pacific territories are vital to U.S. national security and the economy?
Well, they are the United States, and those are American citizens and American nationals, and they're being repeatedly targeted with things like co-panelists talked about in terms of the Guam killer missile, for example, or attempts to undermine their societies. They are a key component of the Trump administration's concept of hemispheric defense. They are America's western border, and as such, they are being heavily targeted by the PRC in a similar way to undermine American security as a whole, that you see a vast number of very odd people coming across the southern border, for example.
Thank you. Thank you again to the witnesses for being here today, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lamalfa. Mr. Lamalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. I had questions for Mr. Chang on the issue of Department of Interior and drones that they are in possession of that have been produced by some, I'd say, pretty questionable sources here. One is DJI, and the software would be from Autel Robotics. Forgive me if you talked about this earlier. I was at a previous stop for a little bit, but these are both, again, Chinese-based companies that are known to be high security threats. Autel is linked to the PRC in their military directly, and our own Pentagon has blacklisted Autel Robotics, citing this threat. So I wonder why in the world would the Department of Interior be using a product that our own Pentagon has blacklisted as being a threatening source of tracking whatever information might be pertinent that Interior is gathering or holding.
Congressman, I am certainly not in a position to explain the actions of the Department of the Interior. What I would say is the following, that first, it is absolutely clear that Chinese robotic companies, like most Chinese companies, are part of the comprehensive threat posed to the United States. Chinese national security law has made very clear, one, all data must be stored in the PRC. Two, That data will be accessed by relevant Chinese authorities, including the Ministries of Public Security, Ministry of State Security, and the People's Liberation Army, at such time that any of those Chinese entities feel that it is incumbent or necessary to do so. There is no right to privacy. There is no restrictions, certainly no equivalent to any of the safeguards that are present in our system. Third is that the Chinese have made very clear through things like Made in China 2025 that they intend to dominate the global market for robots and drones, whether it is desktop or whether it is larger strategic level counterparts of things like our Global Hawk system. All that being said, the Chinese have therefore succeeded through subsidies and honestly through efficient production to make drones that work, that are extremely inexpensive. And if I were to make a guess, and again, I want to emphasize I am not personally aware of how the Department of Interior makes its decisions, I would guess that they went with a lowest bidder strategy without necessarily considering potential implications of loss of control of data.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't expect you to know the whole ins and outs of what Interior is doing, but I guess as an overview, it seems probably a little dangerous that we would be having that department using this type of technology that's so easily absorbing information and sending it right back to PRC, right?
Sir, given the purview of the Department of the Interior, which goes obviously beyond the Department of Insular Affairs, the Office of Insular Affairs, the Department of Interior has knowledge of vast tracts of American land where oil drilling would occur, where other natural resource exploitation would occur. The drones would almost certainly be used to survey that land, and the Chinese would therefore be aware of, one, what is being surveyed, and potentially what areas would be opened for leasing and other contractual arrangements. Recent discussions about Chinese acquisition of farmland has focused on where that farmland is, not the amount, but the location, which is often very close to sensitive and strategic sites. I would suggest that that would include not only military, but also Department of Interior sites.
Thank you. Appreciate that complete answer. Mr. Klingner, we've heard a lot about USAID and some of the really horrific expenditures that have been pushed through that and the efforts of DOGE to narrow it back down to something that would be really the original mission of USAID. What would be the concerns about that and then the possible overall effect in reduction of efforts? Some are contending that we are losing our place in the South Pacific by not having full funding of USAID as it was.
My apologies, sir, but the USAID is outside of my area of responsibility and expertise. There are other colleagues at the Heritage Foundation who could respond to that much better than I. So again,
We
my
don't have them
apologies.
here today, so I know the foundation's done a lot of work in that area. What do you surmise is the direction for that?
The overall direction would be that contracts have been let on issues that are not either in the best interest of the United States or excessive funding has been devoted to them.
Yeah, okay. My time's already up. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malfa. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Hoyle. Ms. Hoyle.
Thank you. I yield my time to Congresswoman Leisure Fernandez.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Hoyle, and thank you for attending the hearing. And as I've mentioned to the chair, I really look forward that we will be invited and be able to travel back and learn from our colleagues about what is happening, especially our colleagues who represent these incredibly important, I hate saying territories, but I guess that's the official word. A question was asked about the USAID cuts, and Mr. Klinger mentioned that it wasn't his area of expertise, but that there was others who could answer that. We actually have somebody who it is his area of expertise. So, Mr. Ben-Cosme, would you respond to that question?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Every administration has the authority and power to set new priorities. And so I think what's most disturbing about these cuts is that it really takes the baby out with the bathwater. You can change the direction of priorities and types of programs that USAID does, but to destroy the entire development tool, to sell our offices or my previous employees' offices to the Customs Border Patrol, to lose generation of expertise, capacity, leadership in these important capabilities has a real detrimental effect to our national security.
Right, and I think what's really also important is, as Ms. Pascal noted, that the OIA is very small. And so when you have USDA, when you have USAID, you are increasing and supplementing the Americans on the ground building trust. And I would ask this, Mr. Klinger, do you believe it is important that our allies feel that they can trust the United States to live up to its commitments?
Very much so. That is one of the things that the U.S. should make very clear to our friends and foes, that we will abide by our treaty commitments, that our forces, not only in the region, but follow-on forces, would be there to hopefully deter, or if necessary, defend and defeat any attacks by North Korea or China on our allies or our strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific region. And
wouldn't you agree that trust is built by actually having a history of consistency, Mr. Klinger?
Very much so. We have had forces on the Korean Peninsula for 70 years, and recently the Trump administration affirmed the U.S. commitments, the ironclad commitments to defend our allies. And we saw that in President Trump's joint statement with Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba affirming our commitments to Japan, and then also Secretary of State Rubio has affirmed, and Secretary of Defense Hegseth have also affirmed our commitment to defending South Korea.
Yeah. And so I think that the real important thing is that when there is the yo-yo, when there is in different parts of the international stage, a swinging back and forth of who we stand with and who we will not abandon, that erodes trust. Because when you abandon one ally, when you engage in a tariff trade war with others, like Canada and Mexico, you are creating a sense of distrust in the United States. I also want to thank the questions that our chair talked about in terms of the importance of the office of the OIA. And I hope that the committee will support additional personnel and additional funding for what has been described as a really essential office. So I do appreciate those. And I yield back my time to Ms. Congresswoman Hoyle if she wants to add anything else.
Nothing else? Nothing further? Okay.
Nothing else, I yield again.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hoyle. The gentleman yields her time back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moylan, for 5 minutes. Mr. Moylan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing today, and thank you to the panel for all the information, professional information that you provide. This is all very helpful, and I appreciate your time and effort. More than 250,000 Americans live in Guam, CNMI, and the American Samoa. For decades, our islands have been critical for national security and regional stability in the Pacific. Moreover, Americans in the Pacific territories serve at a higher rate than anywhere else in our nation, me included. Guam hosts 3 key bases, which serve as a key logistical hub, essential for the movement of personnel and supplies throughout the Indo-PACOM. Additionally, Guam serves as the home port, hub for submarines and supply ships, playing a crucial role in determining the rising threats from PRC and North Korea. Additionally, OIA provides essential funding for the territories and freely associated states, protecting our economy and national security. For Guam, these funding stems are critical for providing public service, increasing economic development, and protecting Americans in the Western Pacific. But despite this, many programs for the territories remain unfunded and have not been adjusted for years. We must work to increasing funding for OIA to deal with problems such as the invasive and stray animal control, IUU fishing, and counter narcotics operations. And over the last several years, methamphetamine use has skyrocketed, creating a public health and safety crisis. And recently, we have even seen fentanyl enter our shores. We must take a nuanced approach to territorial policy making. These issues that we have in Guam are not the same we face in our neighbors. Just 60 miles north, one-size-fits-all policies ignores the territory's unique situation, and we have the potential to negatively impact our economies, education institutions, and healthcare systems. And just one final statement, the USAIDs is not offered to the territories. This is all international based, but it should be. And this is where we need the additional funding. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, I have no questions, but I wish to yield the balance of my time to my friend from the Northern Marianas, Ms. King-Hines. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields his time to Ms. King-Hines. Ms. King-Hines.
Do I still get my full 5 minutes?
Yes, ma'am, you do.
All right. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation or the privilege today of joining today's hearing. I'm the only representative from the Northern Mariana Islands, so it is my duty to speak on behalf of the Americans who live there. I will, in short order, be introducing a bill asking Congress for a $400 million bailout as requested by my governor because the CNMI is on the cusp of an economic collapse. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record the CNMI governor's letter requesting bailout legislation.
Without objection.
I've been writing letters to every agency requesting to spare the CNMI from any cuts to grants or federally funded personnel because our economy is dependent on these funds and positions for survival. We may all be from the territories and share similar challenges, but our economic challenges are very different and unique to each of us. Our governor just refinanced a loan to cover the remainder of this year's fiscal budget. That budget doesn't fully fund operations. The police department on the island of Rhoda does not have money for gas because the budget doesn't fund operations for gas. And so the cops can't patrol there. Legacy businesses like the Hyatt have shut down. Duty-free Shoppers has just announced that it too will be closing shop. Every day when I leave here at 5:30 and the Marianas Day begins, I field phone calls, and I go home at night, I field phone calls from more legacy businesses who are talking about shutting their doors because we don't have enough tourists to keep the door open. Our industry is primarily driven by tourists. The Commonwealth Ports Authority is begging for relief because of the current rate of tourist arrivals. It cannot sustain operations. We have Department of Defense activities that rely on the ports being fully operational for the ongoing training and construction activities critical to our national security. And this is why sometimes having these conversations are very frustrating because too often, conversations about the CNMI and the territories happen about us instead of with us from individuals who've never experienced life there. And too often, discussions about national security treat our people as a liability rather than an asset. We as Americans cannot be expected to stand strong if the CNMI is economically starved into collapse, which is what is happening now. People are going hungry, and when people are going hungry, they're going to do stupid things. This hearing is about prosperity in the Pacific, an acknowledgement that prosperity does not exist there. And all I've heard since coming to Congress are proposals for more restrictions because of geopolitical tensions with China, restrictions to tourism that will only make things worse. I agree with everything that everybody has said on this panel. We are on the same team, and we agree that we must all do our part to address these threats.
Ms. King-Hines, Mr. Moylan's time has expired.
Okay.
We'll come back to you in just a bit. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Puerto Rico, Mr. Hernandez. Mr. Hernandez,
Thank
for
you,
5
Mr.
minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Pascal, in your testimony, you highlighted concerns that the PRC could influence the residents of Guam, American Samoa, and the CNMI to push for independence. A common line of attack that foreign adversaries use against U.S. territories and commonwealths is that any form of territorial status is undemocratic. Do you believe that Congress can enter into democratic relationships with its territories in the Pacific through, for example, a covenant like the Mariana Islands?
The beauty of the covenant is that it was widely debated within CNMI, and it was voted on by the people of CNMI. So that is a consensual relationship entered into with knowledge and dedication, and the people of CNMI are some of the most dedicated Americans I've ever met.
So the answer would be yes.
Yeah.
And do you think it's legitimate for territories like American Samoa to decide on their own that it's a fair trade-off, for example, not to vote for the President of the United States, but to have their own system of land management and be able to protect that?
Yes, so in the end of my written testimony, I sort of describe how different everybody is. I, of course, didn't include Puerto Rico because it wasn't part of the remit, but they are all incredibly different. And American Samoa entered into the relationship with the U.S. as an equal negotiator, state-to-state relationship, and made their decision the way they did.
Thank you, Ms. Pascal, and I completely agree, and I really hope that this committee in the future takes all that into account. Self-determination is a two-way street, and the people of the territories and commonwealths have a right to decide their own future, and that should include any option that the people in the territories and commonwealths want to pursue in accordance to their history, their interests, and their democratic values. So I appreciate your answers. Mr. Benscombe, you mentioned we know that the U.S. has free associated states, it has territories, it has commonwealths, and commonwealths are not just plain territories. From a national security perspective, are the territories and commonwealths better protected from foreign influence than the free associated states?
So my area of expertise is mainly on the freely associated states, but I should say that because of the compacts that were just recently renewed, we've been able to provide assistance which helps bolster resilience against foreign influence from adversaries like China and North Korea.
And given the current political climate, would you say that the Commonwealths and territories financing is more secure than the free associated states under USAID?
So USAID used to operate in the freely associated states, and we did not operate in commonwealths or any territories.
Correct, but given the current political climate, do you think that financing and assistance to the free associated states is under threat given what's happening at USAID?
I do. And in fact, for 2 weeks, people at Interior did not know if the COFA funds were at risk because of the attacks on foreign assistance.
Right, thank you. With that, I yield back the remaining. Oh, I see. Let me see. 1 second. Yeah. One last question I do have is, it's been decades since the Organic Acts and the Covenant have been revised. Would it be positive for the relationships and the democratic nature of these relationships for Congress to engage with the territories and commonwealths to periodically revise and enhance these arrangements? Ms. Pascal?
That's a decision for the people of those locations. That's definitely beyond my remit. I'm Canadian. I have no say in understandings between Americans and their government.
Of course, but if they wanted to, would that be a legitimate exercise of democratic self-government?
Any discussion like that is legitimate. I would highly recommend at the same time that there be not operations, but there be an awareness of how outside actors will launch influence operations to try to affect those outcomes, and that can be countered very easily through transparency. So if we have a better idea of who is funding what on all sides, then it will lead to, I think, more transparent discussions on this topic.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, Ms. King-Hines. Ms. King-Hines, for 5 minutes.
I apologize for going over, Mr. Chairman. So as I was saying, this hearing is about prosperity in the Pacific and acknowledgement that prosperity doesn't exist here. And all I've heard since coming to Congress are proposals for restrictions because of geopolitical tensions with China, restrictions that I believe will only make things worse. And as I've said, we're all on the same team and we must all do our part. You know, since I've been here, I've been hearing a lot about birth tourism, and let's be clear, we all agree that birth tourism is a concern. But it's also very misleading to suggest that the CNMI has been lax on the issue. We are the only jurisdiction through the covenant who has taken real action, urging Congress to amend birthright citizenship for tourists coming into the CNMI, but Congress has never acted. Under President Trump, we partnered with the White House to enhance Chinese tourist screening, creating EVS TAP, a program delayed for 4 years under the Biden administration before finally being implemented. And today, I'm working to strengthen oversight of foreign investments. Yet despite all of this, I haven't heard from a single national security official, not even the Department of Defense over the last 10 years whom I've been directly engaging with, has confirmed that tourism from China itself is a threat. If it's good for California, why is it not good for the Commonwealth so that we can put food on the table? The only answer that I've been getting is that the biggest risk to national security is a collapsed CNMI economy. And that's why I'm here fighting to restore tourism from all markets. They can be from Mars for all I care. That's why I am urging Secretary Rubio to mobilize embassies in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines to secure real support for other markets. That is why I'm pushing for deregulation, expanded labor access, and economic relief. Not restriction as some of the written testimonies have suggested, but actual support that doesn't cost federal taxpayers anything. We can't compete with the mainland for investment or tourism. We don't have oil, we don't have labor, and we face severe geographic and economic constraints. We don't want the status quo, but one-size-fits-all federal policies leave us with no options. It's like putting baby in a corner, you know what I mean? And that's kind of the position that I'm in right now as the delegate. And so, you know, what is the proposal? Basically, I haven't really heard a proposal. I've heard proposals for restrictions, but what are proposals basically for supporting economic opportunities in the CNMI? And so this question then is to Ms. Pasco. In your testimony, you proposed requiring visas for tourists, including Japan and South Korea, which are two of our other primary markets.
I'm sorry, no, I don't. I think that people coming into any part of the United States should have the same entry points. And if you're Chinese coming into California, you need a visa, and as you said, tourism and Chinese tourism in California is just fine. So why would it affect Chinese tourism to CNMI? And just on this point of why PRC tourism is a threat, you just asked Palau. I mean, as you said, economic collapse is your biggest threat, and the PRC deliberately used tourism to try to economically collapse Palau in order to gain strategic advantage, in this case, getting them to derecognize Taiwan.
Thank you for pointing that out, and thank you for using Palau as an illustration of these influences, right? But what creates these opportunities for influence? Is it not economic collapse? Is it not economic vulnerability?
Yes, which is why you can do things. I mean, there are a bunch of recommendations. I did make recommendations, for example, look at cabotage, look at a fast ferry between Guam and Rota.
A ferry between Guam and Rota?
Yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of little tweaks that you can do that can provide sustainable sorts of development that are beyond the tourism sector, that help the people of CNMI in multiple different ways.
So has there been an economic analysis that's been, that anybody has looked at or reviewed or suggested to show that if you completely take out the tourism industry, that hole can be filled in order to be able to support basic government services?
So the idea isn't to take out the tourism sector. The idea is to isolate the sector of tourism that is incredibly unreliable, that comes and goes, that uses itself for economic leverage, for political and strategic advantage. The United States could decide tomorrow that no Chinese tourists can come into the US. And if CNMI has built up its tourism around Chinese tourism, it is going to be incredibly vulnerable. Other tourist sectors are, cabotage would greatly increase the chances of increases in Japanese tourism, for example. So, for those who don't know this issue, in the US, you can't have a foreign carrier flying between 2 points in the US. So you can't have a Japanese airline that flies to Saipan and then to Guam. If a Japanese carrier could do that, that would greatly lower costs for the people of CNMI and Guam to travel in the region and take away some of that chokehold that United has, which affects all sorts of other economic growth factors, and it would increase Japanese tourism.
And all this based on an opinion, but not based on an actual economic analysis that assesses what the real economic underlying challenges are, like remote geography, cost of transportation.
Yeah, so CNMI isn't actually that remote if you can unlock the transportation in the region. If you can get out of that United Airlines chokehold that has on the region, you're actually not very far away. And you have access. Guam, for example, has all sorts of access all over the region, and you can build up other sectors like health. People from the FAS need better health care, and there could be health centers and education centers in CNMI. The College Northern Marianas could be really built up to be a comfortable place for the people from FAS to come and study and learn more about their cousins across the region.
Ms. King-Hines, your time has expired. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Dr. Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you and the ranking member for organizing this committee and putting this oversight to allow us as Congress to have greater insight into the threats facing U.S. territories and the freely associated states. I'm really appreciative of the witnesses for bringing yourselves all the way here to this place as well. We're grateful to have your testimony. I'm committed to working with Congress and the Trump administration to maintain military and economic security in the Indo-Pacific. And had a question for Mr. Chang. In 2023, a PRC-backed hacking group called Volt Typhoon hacked telecommunications systems in Guam. These hacks attacked critical infrastructure on the island, including those used by the U.S. military bases. So in our present day, is the PRC still actively attempting to launch cyber attacks against the U.S., and if so, in what ways?
Sir, in the wake of Volt Typhoon, we have various cybersecurity groups and the U.S. government have identified at least 2 new Chinese-sourced attacks in just simply the Typhoon series. Salt Typhoon, which involved Chinese penetration of various U.S. telecoms, including Verizon and AT&T, to obtain remarkably granular data on various users. It is believed that this has included the cell phones of Vice President Vance and then President-elect Trump. We have also seen an attack labeled Flax Typhoon, Chinese cyber attacks on Taiwanese organizations. This basically is a form of living off the land where basically rather than introducing malware, they are using already existing tools, security systems, et cetera, built into programs. Those are just simply 2 examples simply from a particular family of Chinese hackers. More broadly speaking, there is no evidence that I am aware of with regards to a reduction in Chinese cyber economic espionage, Chinese hacking of various organizations around the world, not just the United States, but our allies, military, economic, et cetera. There is every reason to believe that the Chinese, if anything, have redoubled their efforts as the Chinese pursue what they term intelligenceization of their military and economy, which is basically promoting the ability of machines to talk to machines, going beyond the previous people talking to people and organizations talking to organizations.
Thank you for that very disturbing report. I'm sorry to hear that. So how do the attacks, outside of what you've said about President Trump and Vice President Vance, how are these attacks affecting our citizens that live in the territories or the citizens that live in the continental United States?
So with regards to the citizens in the territories, it basically means that military personnel, but also civilians, politicians, police officers potentially have their personal data being accessed. That in turn, of course, opens them up to potential recruitment as human intelligence sources, pressure. Because of the comprehensive approach that I mentioned earlier to Chairman Hurd, what that also means is that, for example, in theory, Chinese companies could use this to pressure their way into access. If Chinese criminal organizations were to access this kind of information, they too would potentially be able to exploit it. With regards to on the mainland, my understanding is that one of the things that may have been exposed through Salt Typhoon is access to wiretaps. Not just legal wiretaps in the sense of criminal, but potentially intelligence-oriented wiretaps authorized under FISA. That would obviously expose intelligence operations, potentially sources and methods.
Thank you for that answer as well. So we know China is constantly undermining the United States by mistreating U.S. territories, allies, and stealing American intellectual property. That's why I introduced the United States Research Protection Act. This legislation removes ambiguity in what qualifies as a malign foreign talent program and ensures there are no loopholes in its language that could inadvertently allow adversarial nations like China to exploit American research and technology for their own benefit. By closing these critical loopholes, the United States Research Protection Act ensures that our technological advancements remain secure and safeguarded from foreign exploitation. It also reaffirms a commitment to protecting American taxpayers by ensuring that their investments in research and development are not used to subsidize the capabilities of our strategic competitors, such as the Chinese Communist Party. And Mr. Chair, I'll thank again these witnesses for coming and testifying with us, and with that, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy. I want to also thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and my fellow members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask that you respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Monday, March 10th, 2025. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.